what would you define as a populist leader?
A populist leader is, it has two elements to it. On the one hand, it's a leadership style. It has to do with being personally charismatic, but also of doing politics in a way in which the focus is on the individual leader rather than a political party or a group of people. It also tends to be authoritarian. So not only do we focus on a leader, but power gets concentrated there. That's the leadership style. And it's also associated with a set of ideas. And two or three tend to be quite critical, but perhaps the most is this distinction between, of we the people, however we're going to define that, and the enemy of the people. And that enemy is typically an internal elite, those who are in power at the moment who we are going to displace. Sometimes it's foreigners, imperialists, foreign investors, it depends on the situation. So you have this particular kind of leadership style and this emphasis on we the people who are opposed to this elite, and there is this leader come savior who is going to represent the people and take us where we need to go.
Okay, so I have to ask now, because I'm actually very fascinated by this, purely because my granddad was, I think, Kenneth Kaunda. So sometimes I wonder if he rose to power because he was a populist leader. So I have to ask now, so what are some of the repercussions of populism in society?
Well, there are two in particular. One's political and one's social. The political effect is, this is really the exercise of power by an individual. It is very authoritarian. It's always in the name of the people, but because that person embodies the will of the people, it seems logical that he should be able to do whatever he wants, because after all, he reflects what it is the people want. And in the process, you can run roughshod over existing institutions like parliaments or judicial systems, and the rule of law, because insofar as these are obstructing the leader, they are obstructing the people. And so that's the populist logic of essentially pushing those things aside when they prove to be obstacles.
Would you?
And that's the political side. There is a social side too. The social side is this notion of there's we the people. We share a common set of beliefs, a common set of values, a common set of desires. Given that commonality, there's very little room for difference or debate or dissent. To be different or to dissent is essentially to alienate yourself from the people. And at that point, you're no longer a proper participant in politics. And so it can be very divisive and destructive of either any kind of reasonable political opposition or perhaps even ethnic groups who reflect minority positions in a country.
Would you consider President Trump a populist leader by any chance?
Yes, I think he has a lot of those characteristics. His leadership style is very personal. It's very much focused on him. It tends to be rather authoritarian. Those who disagree with him are out, or those who disagree with him are characterized as both personal enemies and, in the end, enemies of the people. And he also very much talks about, in a very populist way, that he is going to represent the ordinary American against the elite establishment in Washington, in Wall Street, and in the culture, those people who run the big newspapers, or people like me who are professors in universities. So he is very much speaking that language. And anybody who differs becomes un-American, essentially an enemy of the people.
Given the
Yeah.
rise of populist leaders in recent history, and when you look at the election results that were coming out, of course, you did have former Vice President Biden in the lead, and then there was Mr. Trump. And then following that, there was two other parties in between, but Kanye West was running in fifth as an independent presidential candidate. Now, do you think that America will ever see a day when Kanye West or people like him would actually see office without ever having sat in any sort of political office or having ever held any sort of political office?
Well, first of all, we already see it with Trump, who never sat in any political office or held any political position. Kanye West may be even more of a stretch, but I think, you know, what is happening in the United States, Trump didn't create the circumstance that America found itself in 2016 or 2020. He took advantage of something that was already there. I think one of the things that people don't realize, if you live in an African country where the institutionalization of democracy is relatively new, you have a keen sense of both its novelty and its fragility, that it's vulnerable. And then you look at places like England, France, or the United States, and you think these are well-established democracies. I mean, nothing can really shake them. And it is to overestimate the strength of democracy. Democracies are potentially always fragile because at some level they ultimately rely on the people. And the people often aren't able to bear the kinds of responsibilities that democracy imposes on them.
And then my final question, just before I let you go, I wanted to look at the persons who actually elect these populist leaders into power. So is it something to do with the society at the moment that would then drive people to completely vote the person into power? Or is it something that is actually just, how do I put this? Let me just put it this way. What would actually drive someone to put a populist leader in power? Because as you said, it has elements of dictatorship and authoritarian behaviors and quite often radicalism. So what would actually drive someone to go and cast their vote and say, I think that you represent what I need in my country?
I think because part of what you have to look at is the alternative with which people are presented. The alternative is some notion of a sort of, broadly speaking, liberal democracy, where you have a parliament, you have a rule of law, you have representation, you have a notion of the fact that people will have different preferences and beliefs, and that is reasonable and appropriate, and they will disagree, and that is fine. That is part of the process. And I think that system of government is really quite complicated. This notion of government as a complex administrative entity that has parliaments and presidents and a judiciary, and they aren't all lined up with each other, is complicated. And the notion that there are people who can have different values that I do, have different beliefs, may look differently than I look, and that somehow they have just as much right to be who they are as I do, I mean, it's also kind of strange and demanding to recognize that kind of abstract sense of what it means to be a citizen and have the rights of a citizen. And so all of that, I think, is rather confusing. And people look to populists who say, you know what, it is confusing. And not only is it confusing, it's wrong. You can't run a country with all this complication. You need, like an army needs a general to tell the troops what to do, a country needs a leader who can tell the people what to do. And you know what? And when it comes to differences, those people who have different values than you do, well, they're just wrong. They're wrong and they're evil. And so they don't deserve rights. They don't deserve to be heard. They just need to be marginalized or repressed. And that way of characterizing the situation is simple in a way that people can readily understand. And so the populist comes in and says, you know what, what seems so confusing and inefficient to you, it is confusing, it is inefficient, and it's unnecessary. And let me tell you how we really need to do things in a very simple, straightforward way. And people understand it, and therefore they can embrace it. And in addition to this understanding issue, that populist also gives a certain legitimacy to the anxiety people feel about the uncertainty in their lives and the fear that they have. And he says, you have a right to be anxious, you have a right to be afraid, and you know what? You have a right to be angry about all that, because it doesn't have to be that way. And I'm going to provide something different. And that's an extremely attractive message, which people are very ready to hear and accept.
My final question to you, this is more just wanting to know your opinion. Who do you think is the most notorious populist leader of our history?
Of whose history?
American history, let's put it that way.
I mean, there's a lot in the American context. Of course, no one has been as successful as Trump. And so he would have to win in the American context. Bolsonaro in Brazil, he deserves a lot of points as well. Maybe Wade in Senegal or Zuma in South Africa did very well. I don't know enough about Michael Sata, so I'm going to be cautious there because it's your country. But people like Bolsonaro and Trump. And we'll see what Obrador is like in Mexico as well. He seems to be moving in a similar direction from the left rather than from the right.
Professor, thank you very much for joining me.